The Korean Peninsula remains as perhaps the last remnant of the Cold War. During those 44 years between 1947 and 1992, considering that the USSR collapsed just 5 days before New Year, several countries across the world were divided between the two blocks. Some of the common examples was East-West Germany, North-South Vietnam, and the North-South of Korea. While the former two have united into one nation, this division in the Korean Peninsula still remains to this very second. And this division is so intense that one might even be able to notice it right from space. Before we look out for possibilities of, say, a reunification of Korea, we must first try to understand the history behind this contested region so that we can harness the true intent behind the division as well as look for factors which influence the reunification in a more holistic way. Without much ado, let's get into today's episode. Before we start, dear listener, I just want you to keep in mind something very important. Although the Cold War paradigm revolved around a mutually assured destruction by using nuclear weapons, we must understand and remember that conventional wars still remain a reality, because it was never about sort of nuking each other, but it was about restraining oneself from using a nuclear weapon to such an excruciating oblivion. With that being said, let's take a look at the events which led to the eventful division of the peninsula. The Korean Peninsula came under Japanese occupation in 1910 after the Russo-Japanese War. The peninsula was occupied by Imperial Japan until the end of World War II, which occurred on 15th of August 1945. The peninsula was liberated from Japan in the aftermath of the war. However, the peninsula was divided along the 38th parallel, as both the Soviet forces and the US Pacific forces jointly attacked the region from the north-south axis respectively. The Soviet Union invaded Manchuria starting on August 8, 1945, and had plans to fight the Japanese directly teeth to teeth. Unfortunately for the Soviet Union, no large-scale battles occurred as Japan surrendered soon after. Now one might ask, why the 38th parallel? The 38th parallel was chosen by Colonel Dean Rusk and Colonel Charles H. Bonesteel of the United States Army as a rendezvous point between the American and the Soviet forces in Korea. It was very soon decided that the peninsula would be temporarily divided amongst the two occupying forces and be reunited after a 5-year trusteeship period. The North would be governed by the Soviets, whereas the South by the United States. The 38th parallel also effectively put Seoul, the capital city of undivided Korea, on the southern half, surprisingly to which the Soviets agreed. While the new occupiers were plotting an artificial boundary dividing the peninsula, the Koreans disliked this idea. After years of being subdued by foreign powers and internal turmoil, for once the Koreans wanted to live in peace and harmony. However, neither the US nor the Soviets ever considered the people's opinions and continued with their plans. Elections were held to elect their respective leaders. The elections resulted in two equally aggressive and pragmatic leaders to ascend the ladder of hierarchy. That is, Kim Il-sung for North Korea and Syngman Rhee for the South. Both Kim and Rhee were authoritarians who wanted to unite the Korean Peninsula under their respective regimes. Both were thinking of doing it one time or the other, and of course at the earliest. Rhee, however, was not very popular in South, as it was speculated that his victory was a result of a rigged election, in which he obtained an overwhelming majority of, guess how much? 92.3%. Rhee was a preferred candidate by the United States government as he spoke fluent English, had already lived in America and knew how they functioned, and last but not least, was staunchly anti-communist. A wave of uprisings occurred within South Korea, first unaided and later funded and aided by the North Koreans to bring down Ri's regime. Simultaneously, small-scale border skirmishes became a common occurrence throughout the years 1948 to 1950 between the two Korean armies. While this happened, both the Soviets and the Americans started packing their bags and withdraw from Korea. The Soviets withdrew from North in 1948 and the following year the US from South. As the situation seemed right for both Kim and Ri, it was time to unleash their respective plans. But the bigger question is, who will make the first move? On June 25, 1950, a 70,000 strong Korean People's Army, that is the National Army of North Korea, invaded South and by August 1st had cornered the remaining Republic of Korea army, that is the South Korean army, within a stronghold perimeter around the port town of Busan. The capital Seoul had fallen within the first week of the conquest. Sensing that the situation was spiraling out of control, the United States government began to rush forces to aid the southern defenders. The South Korean army was no match to the experienced North Korean army, who were also well supplied with weapons, manpower and intelligence by Soviet Russia and the newly formed People's Republic of China. Sensing that the North Koreans had seemingly an upper hand in combat, the American-led UN forces under the tactful command of General Douglas MacArthur had this massive task of finding a way to break the enemy's back. Apart from incessant aerial bombardment and crippling naval blockade, the UN forces executed a series of daring amphibious assaults and landings at Incheon between 10th and 19th of September, which changed the course of combat in the first leg of the war. The amphibious landings at Incheon were the largest and deadliest since D-Day landings at Normandy during the Second World War. The capital Seoul was soon liberated and the Busan perimeter was breached by the South Korean and the UN forces, and thus the push towards North had begun. However, the American administration at that time did not want an all-out destruction of North Korea, as they feared that the Chinese or the Soviets might interfere and might potentially lead to a Third World War. Nonetheless, as the retreating North Koreans were being pushed towards the Sino-Korean border, something unexpected happened. The Chinese decided to intervene. On 25th October 1950, the Chinese People's Volunteer Army entered Korea, attacking UN troops. The KPA-PVA alliance had overrun Seoul for the second time by January 1951, and their offensive was going stronger and stronger. However, as their supply lines stretched, they were driven back to the north of the 38th parallel by July the same year. The war ran into a stalemate since then, until an armistice was signed on 27th of July 1953. However, peace was never achieved, as Syngman Rhee and the delegates representing South Korea never signed the armistice. While many think that the war ended effectively with the signing of the armistice by the other parties, that was the United States of America, the People's Republic of China, and North Korea, it is untrue, as technically the refusal by South to sign makes the war run to this day. The armistice led to the creation of the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, a 4-kilometer wide buffer zone dividing the two Koreas. 2 million soldiers stand guard overlooking the DMZ on each side to prevent another Korean war. It leads me to ask several questions. What was the likelihood of the Korean offensive to be successful ever since the beginning? Could the North Koreans have won the war entirely by themselves? What would have happened if the US government did not intervene? And even if they did intervene, what would have happened if the Chinese did not end up supporting the North Koreans? What would have happened if the Soviet Union decided to fully engage in active combat? Could it have snowballed into a third world war? To find out the answer to these kinds of what if questions, especially that of what if the two Koreas reunited, stay tuned for the next episode. Until then, this is your friendly historian Arjun signing off.